What if a single line, drawn on a piece of paper, could save more lives than any weapon in history? What if one ordinary man carrying nothing but a sketch changed the fate of every pilot who ever landed on a carrier? On a cold November morning in 1951, Captain Dennis Cambell climbed the gangway to HMS Illustrious with a simple diagram in his briefcase, a flight deck tilted 10 degrees to port. To anyone else, it was just a doodle. To Cambell, it was a desperate attempt to stop the quiet slaughter that had haunted his service. He didn't know it yet, but within 18 months, that idea would rewrite the rules of naval aviation. The paper in his hand would save more airmen than any bomb, any gun, any armor plate ever designed. But at that moment, he only knew the horror of the numbers. In a single year, 43 Royal Navy aircraft had been destroyed trying to land. 17 pilots were dead, dozens more crippled. Every accident happened in the final half-minute of flight, when a 30-ton jet tried to hook a wire on a pitching, heaving deck. Missed the wire, and the steel barricade waited ahead like a guillotine. The United States Navy was faring even worse. In 1951 alone, they suffered 776 major crashes, 2 every single day. And this was peacetime. During the Korean War, the carnage only grew. The carrier Boxer saw 7 barrier crashes in one cruise. The Princeton lost 9 aircraft in a month. There were no soft failures on a straight-deck carrier. You either caught the wire or you hit the barrier at full power. Many pilots never even reached the barricade. They plowed into the aircraft parked forward, detonating fuel and ammunition, turning the deck into an inferno that could kill a dozen men in seconds. Jets had arrived, but the ships hadn't caught up. The new F-9F Panthers landed 40 knots faster than the old propeller-driven Hellcats, and their engines took 7 long seconds to spool up if a pilot needed to climb away. An eternity when you were falling toward the sea at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers waved frantically with paddles, but their gestures came too late. By the time a pilot saw he was low or fast, his fate was already sealed by momentum and gravity. Every admiral, every engineer, every pilot knew the same terrible truth. Carrier aviation was killing its own men faster than war ever could. Jets were the future. But the future meant nothing if it came wrapped in body bags. What Cambell didn't yet know was that his wild idea would be mocked, dismissed, and called impossible by the very men whose job was to solve the impossible. And he couldn't know that the breakthrough would come not from laboratories or admirals, but from his refusal to accept that that's just how it is. The age of jet-powered flight had pushed carrier aviation to its breaking point, and breaking points have a way of demanding heroes. But who would dare to challenge the very shape of a ship? That answer began 6 years earlier, with the first jet to ever touch a carrier deck, and the warning the world ignored. The problem began long before Dennis Cambell's moment of inspiration. It started in 1945 when Lieutenant Commander William P. Bill Rona made history, and unknowingly sounded an alarm no one would heed. His jet, the FR-1 Fireball, touched down on the deck of USS Wake Island at 90 knots, 20 faster than any piston aircraft of the war. The arresting cables screamed as they caught him, barely holding. The landing was celebrated as progress, but it was really a warning disguised as success. Jet engines had changed everything. They were faster, heavier, slower to respond, and utterly unforgiving. By 1950, every Navy on Earth faced the same nightmare. Jet engines had given speed and altitude, but they'd also built a deadly trap on final approach. Propeller pilots could chop throttle and drop neatly onto the deck. Jet pilots couldn't. Their engines took too long to recover power, so they had to land power on, throttles high, no margin for hesitation. That meant when a jet missed the wires, it couldn't climb away in time. It slammed into the barricade, or worse, the rows of aircraft parked ahead, the fuel trucks, the men standing on the deck. The arithmetic was cruel. A Panther approaching at 125 knots covered over 200 feet per second. Miss all 4 arresting wires, and you had just over 2 seconds before meeting steel and fire. The barricades built to catch those jets worked, sometimes. When they didn't, they tore through parked planes, ignited gasoline stores, and turned flight decks into floating crematoriums. Captain Bruce Williams aboard USS Kearsarge watched 11 men die when a barrier failed in March 1951. The official report read like an obituary list. 11 dead, 23 injured, 14 aircraft destroyed. The deck stayed silent for 48 hours. Everyone tried to solve it. The British tested the flex deck, a rubberized surface meant to catch aircraft without landing gear. Safe in theory, terrifying in practice. The Americans poured millions into stronger barricades and mechanical net systems. The French tried to lighten their aircraft. None of it worked. The crashes continued, and the numbers only grew. One British admiral put it bluntly, "We're trying to land 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships." Everyone agreed the system was broken. Nobody knew how to fix it. That was when Captain Dennis Royal Fawson Cambell, a quiet officer with no engineering degree and no expectation of glory, refused to look away. Born in 1907 in Southsea, he'd served through the war, flown the obsolete Swordfish torpedo bombers, and earned his Distinguished Service Cross. By 1951, he was stuck behind a desk, a bureaucrat managing paperwork for the Ministry of Supply, a forgotten pilot who couldn't forget the faces of men lost to bad design. When one of his former students, Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, died in a landing accident that should have been survivable, something broke inside him. Lithgow had done everything right. Perfect approach, perfect speed, but missed the wires by 6 feet. The barricade failed, and the explosion killed him instantly. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Cambell stood at the funeral and whispered to his deputy, "We're murdering them with our own equipment. There has to be another way." Most officers let words like that fade at gravesides. Cambell didn't. He collected accident reports, interviewed landing officers, pored over deck layouts. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a pilot, and he began to draw. One night on a train from Portsmouth to London, he filled a notebook with sketches of carrier decks, over and over, searching for space that didn't exist. And then, almost idly, he tilted his pencil line 10 degrees to port. A slanted flight path, an angled deck. In an instant, the problem inverted itself. If the landing area wasn't parallel to the ship, a missed approach no longer ended in steel. It ended in air. A pilot who missed the wires could pour on power and climb away. No barrier, no parked planes, no fireball. Just sky, ocean, and a second chance. It was so simple, it felt absurd. Surely someone had thought of it before. Surely there was a reason it hadn't been done. But what if there wasn't? Cambell stared at the drawing, feeling that quiet pulse of realization that changes history. But how do you convince a Navy, and the world, that the answer to hundreds of deaths is just a slanted line on paper? That battle was about to begin. How do you convince an empire that its ships are built wrong? How do you walk into a room full of admirals and tell them that their billion-pound carriers, their pride, their power, need to be redrawn with a slant? Dennis Cambell was about to find out. When he presented his sketch at the Ministry of Supply, the reaction was laughter first, then silence, then anger. The chief of Naval Air Warfare called it geometrically ridiculous. Another official asked if he was suggesting ships sail sideways. A third muttered that, if a man wants to die, there are easier ways. But Cambell didn't flinch. He stood there calm and certain and said, "Gentlemen, if this idea works, every pilot will come home." That was all he had, conviction and a pencil drawing. He wasn't allowed to test it officially. The Navy refused to fund even a model trial. But Cambell had allies, a few test pilots and engineers who'd seen too many funerals. Together they made a plan so simple it bordered on rebellion. They would paint the angled deck onto an existing ship and see what happened. No modifications, no funding, just paint and nerve. HMS Triumph was chosen. A post-war carrier due for overhaul, her deck quiet, her captain sympathetic. In early 1952, a team of sailors spent the night rolling out white lines across the dark asphalt, 10 degrees to port. The next morning, pilots were briefed to pretend the deck was angled and make simulated landings using the painted pattern. They flew approach after approach, following the new glide path, ignoring the old wires. And something extraordinary happened. The pattern worked. Pilots reported the new sightline felt natural, safer, smoother, more forgiving. Missed approaches ended with climbouts, not crashes. For the first time in years, they could wave off without fear. Word spread quietly through the fleet air arm. Cambell's angle might be real, but rumors weren't enough. The Admiralty wanted proof. Cambell needed a real landing, on a real ship, with real aircraft. And that meant risk. If the test failed, the idea would die forever. He got his chance aboard HMS Illustrious in 1952, now modified with temporary markings and arrestor wires shifted to match the new pattern. The test pilot was Commander Eric Winkle Brown, the most experienced naval aviator in history, holder of more carrier landings than any man alive. Before takeoff, Brown told Cambell, "If it doesn't work, I'll find out the hard way." As Illustrious pitched in the gray Atlantic swell, Brown lined up for his first approach on the world's first angled deck. Onlookers held their breath. The jet descended, the deck rolling beneath it, and, with a thud that echoed across the carrier, the hook caught the wire dead center. No bounce. No skid. Perfect. Brown powered up, took off again, and tried a missed approach, deliberately flying over the wires and going around. This time he cleared the ship safely. No barrier, no panic. For the first time in naval history, a jet could miss and survive. On the flight deck, Cambell watched with tears he didn't bother to hide. Years of ridicule had just evaporated in one landing. Every pilot watching knew they were seeing the future. Yet the test was classified. The world wouldn't know for months. But within the wardroom, quiet voices began to change. The skepticism was gone. One commander said softly, "It's so simple, we were blind not to see it." Another whispered, "This could save hundreds." And still, Cambell wasn't celebrating. He knew this was only proof of concept. The real battle, to convince two entire navies to rebuild their ships, had just begun. But how do you turn a painted line into a revolution that reshapes every carrier on Earth? That next fight would pit one stubborn captain against the entire weight of tradition. And he wasn't done winning. News travels fast at sea, faster still when it carries a whiff of salvation. Within weeks of the Illustrious test, quiet memos began to circulate between London and Washington. The British Admiralty had proven something unthinkable, that a ship's flight deck didn't need to run straight down its spine. The Americans, drowning in their own crash reports, were desperate for answers. They sent observers, engineers, and pilots to see this strange new angled deck in action. When they returned home, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics took the proposal straight to Admiral L.P. Cat Ramsey. His response was blunt. "If it works, we'll build it tomorrow." But not everyone believed. Many within the American establishment dismissed it as British eccentricity. Some engineers claimed the angled deck would make ships unstable, impossible to launch and recover aircraft simultaneously. Others said it was too radical, too expensive, too different. Tradition was an anchor, and anchors resist movement. Yet the numbers kept piling up. Hundreds of jets lost to barriers, millions of dollars in wreckage, families waiting for men who wouldn't come home. The skeptics were losing their ground to the math of death. By 1953, HMS Centaur became the first British carrier to receive a fully functional angled deck, not painted, but rebuilt, wires and lights aligned to the new geometry. When her sea trials began, the difference was immediate. Pilots who had trained on straight decks described the new system as liberation. One even said, "For the first time, I'm landing, not surviving." The U.S. Navy took notice. In 1954, they modified USS Antietam with a 10.5-degree deck, built from steel plates welded overnight in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. She sailed for trials in the Chesapeake Bay, and the results were nothing short of stunning. Jets that once needed emergency barricades now missed wires safely. Touchdowns were smoother. Flight operations doubled. For the first time, aircraft could launch and recover at the same time. The deck that was once a narrow corridor of death had become a living runway, safe, fluid, and fast. Admiral Ramsay cabled London within hours. The concept is sound. Begin conversions immediately. The message reached Cambell's desk on a quiet Sunday morning. For a moment he didn't move. The man once laughed out of rooms now held the attention of every navy on Earth. The angled deck was no longer a theory. It was the standard of the future. But history's irony is merciless. Because while his idea was spreading across oceans, Dennis Cambell himself was being forgotten. His name was buried in paperwork, his contribution officially described as a team development. Admirals signed the memos, engineers wrote the reports, and Cambell's name appeared only once, as liaison. Yet every pilot who landed safely owed his life to that one slanted line in a notebook. By 1955, both the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy had committed to full conversions. The innovation raced faster than the bureaucrats could write orders. Carriers once destined for scrap were reborn with angled decks, mirror landing systems, and new arrestor gear. Accidents plummeted. Survival rates soared. In a single year, the Royal Navy's fatal deck crashes dropped by more than 70%. But Cambell wasn't counting statistics anymore. He was watching the sea. Every time a pilot caught a wire or waved off safely, he knew that line, that simple 10-degree defiance, had worked. Still, for a man who'd saved so many, recognition didn't come easy. Because even heroes can disappear when their inventions become too successful. And as the jet age roared into the Cold War, the world forgot the man who made it possible for pilots to come home alive. History rarely remembers the quiet men. It remembers the generals, the admirals, the battles, not the engineer with the pencil, not the pilot with an idea. Dennis Cambell's name faded into the footnotes of naval reports, buried beneath the machinery of bureaucracy. When the U.S. Navy introduced its next generation of supercarriers, Forrestal, Saratoga, Ranger, every one of them bore an angled deck, mirror landing system, and jet-compatible layout. The men who designed them called it standard architecture. Few remembered that the standard had once been a heresy. Cambell continued to serve quietly, commanding HMS Vengeance, then HMS Bulwark. He was knighted in 1974, but not for the invention that saved more pilots than any weapon ever built, rather for services to naval aviation. It was a phrase so broad that even he once joked, "I suppose that includes the angle." Yet those who knew him understood the truth. Every pilot who landed safely on a carrier deck, every crewman who slept through the night without hearing the crash alarm, owed that piece to a man who refused to accept death as routine. By the 1960s, angled decks were universal. Soviet carriers adopted them. The French and Australians followed. Even Japan, whose wartime carriers once symbolized destruction, rebuilt theirs with Cambell's geometry. The transformation was total, quiet, and permanent. A rare victory for logic over pride. The flight deck, once a strip of terror, had become a symbol of precision and safety. And all of it, every life saved, every mission completed, every son who came home, traced back to that moment on a train, when one man tilted a line 10 degrees and refused to straighten it. But Cambell never spoke of legacy. When a journalist asked him years later how it felt to have changed naval aviation forever, he smiled and said, "I just wanted my pilots to have a second chance." He died in 1990, at 82, modest to the end. There were no monuments, no speeches, just a small funeral in Southsea and a folded naval flag on the coffin. Yet out on every ocean, on every carrier deck, his legacy lives in motion. The rhythm of tires hitting steel, the hook catching wire, the roar of an engine spooling up for another try. The sound of survival. And so the question remains, how much difference can one line make? How far can a single stroke of imagination reach across time? For Dennis Cambell, it stretched from a page in a notebook to every horizon the sea can hold. It saved thousands, redefined an entire era, and turned tragedy into triumph. All because one man looked at the straight path of tradition and dared to bend it. So the next time a pilot lands safely on a deck somewhere in the dark, remember this. Beneath that 10-degree angle lies not just steel and paint, but the proof that even the simplest ideas can change the world forever. January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the Caribbean morning is clear, the sea calm, the horizon endless. On the flight deck of USS Antietam, every officer, mechanic, and signalman stands at attention. History is about to take off and land for the first time. Lieutenant Commander Harold "Hal" Buell climbs into the cockpit of his F-9F-5 Panther. He's an old-school naval aviator, 43 carrier landings, a veteran of Korea, and a man who's buried more friends than he can count. He's been told this flight will feel different. He doesn't trust that word. As his jet idles, Buell stares down the deck. It's wrong. It looks wrong. The landing area now slants 8 degrees to port, cutting across the ship's axis. His brain screams this isn't how it's supposed to be. Every instinct drilled into him through war says, hit the wires or hit the barricade. There's no in-between. Except today, there is. He takes off, circles the ship, and enters the landing pattern. Antietam Tower, Panther Ball 3.2. Roger, ball, the landing signal officer replies, voice steady. Call the deck. The Panther drops toward the ocean, its nose rocking slightly in the warm Cuban air. Buell adjusts trim, lining up the angled deck in his sight. Everything feels tilted. The horizon, the ship, the world itself. He's on glide path, until he isn't. A gust lifts his aircraft 6 feet too high. On a straight deck, this is where panic sets in. The LSO would wave him off, Buell would pull power, and maybe he'd make it back around for another try. Or maybe not, but the LSO says nothing. He watches, waiting. Buell's wheels touch down, bounce once, his tailhook skipping all 4 wires. He's missed them all. On any other day, that would be the end. The barricade looming, death seconds away. But there is no barricade. There's just clean air and open sea. He slams the throttle forward. The Panther's engine spools up, slow, agonizing, 6 seconds that feel like eternity. Then the jet lifts. Buell climbs away. Alive. 23 seconds later, he's back in the pattern. This time the approach is smooth, calm. He catches the 3-wire perfectly. The deck crew erupts in cheers, some of them crying openly. Later that day, Buell writes in his logbook, "To an experienced tailhooker, landing on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I wasn't afraid of dying during every approach." Over the next 60 days, Carrier Air Group 8 performs 1,227 landings on Antietam's angled deck. They record 8 bolters, 8 missed wire go-arounds. On straight decks, those 8 would have meant 5 barrier crashes, 2 aircraft destroyed, maybe 1 or 2 pilots dead. On the angled deck, 0 crashes, 0 aircraft lost, 0 pilots injured. The numbers are undeniable. But it isn't numbers that change minds. It's stories like Buell's. He tells them what it felt like, the fear melting away, the confidence returning. He says it felt like learning to fly again, but without the dread of dying for a mechanical design. Within 3 months, every carrier commander from Norfolk to Yokosuka is asking the same question. When can we get our decks angled too? But the world isn't convinced yet. The bureaucrats still have doubts. The engineers still have formulas to prove. And Captain Dennis Cambell, the man whose pencil sketch started it all, is about to face the most unexpected reaction of his life. Because sometimes, when you save lives, the world doesn't thank you. It questions you harder. The data was clear. The pilots were alive. And yet the Navy's top brass wanted to shut it down. Why? Because they believed the angled deck broke the laws of naval engineering. What happened next would turn one man's sketch into a global revolution. You'd think saving lives would win universal applause. But history doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the hardest fight comes after you've already proven you're right. By spring of 1953, Antietam's angled deck trials had made headlines in every naval air office from Washington to Whitehall. The results were undeniable. Fewer crashes, fewer funerals, and a new kind of confidence among pilots who'd lived too long on the edge of catastrophe. Yet when Captain Dennis Cambell presented the official results in London, the first response from the Admiralty wasn't celebration. It was skepticism. Coincidence, one senior officer scoffed. A few lucky landings. Statistically insignificant, said another. One admiral went further. This is dangerous nonsense. It'll never be approved for the fleet. The men who commanded the world's most powerful navies couldn't believe something so simple could solve a problem their engineers had failed to fix for nearly a decade. An 8-degree slant? A line of paint? Surely there had to be more to it. But there wasn't. That was the genius. And the threat. If a single sketch could save hundreds of pilots, what did that say about all their committees, their research grants, their progress reports? Cambell didn't mean to embarrass anyone. But in the rigid hierarchy of 1950s military bureaucracy, genius from the wrong desk could be treated as mutiny. Still, he refused to let it die. He and his ally, engineer Louis Boddington, prepared a formal technical brief, 54 pages of data, diagrams, and pilot reports. They hand-delivered it to the Admiralty and to the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. The U.S. brass called for another test. This time it wouldn't be just a painted line. They'd rebuild a carrier. For real. USS Antietam became the first operational carrier in the world with a fully functional angled flight deck. Welded steel, not paint. Permanent. The risk was enormous. If the concept failed, Antietam would be a billion-dollar embarrassment, and every officer who'd supported it would be finished. And yet, the first full operation cycle proved what the numbers had been screaming all along. The angled deck worked. Landing accidents dropped by 75%. Fatalities linked to barricades plunged by more than 80%. In a single year, the U.S. Navy went from losing an aircraft every other day to one every 6. But statistics weren't the real story. The pilots were. The pilots were. Lieutenant James Davidson, for instance, March 8, 1953. Hydraulic failure. No flaps. Landing speed 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, he'd have ditched in the ocean. On Antietam, he made 4 approaches, missed the wires each time, and still had space to go around. On the 5th try, he caught the 4th wire doing 142 knots, the fastest successful carrier landing on record. He wrote to Cambell 6 months later, "Sir, I never met you, but I'm alive to write this letter because you refuse to accept that good pilots should die for bad design. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there because of you." That letter spread like wildfire through naval aviation circles. The skeptics stopped laughing. The tone changed from impossible to, how fast can we retrofit our carriers? By 1955, HMS Ark Royal launched with an angled deck built from the keel up. The Americans converted Midway, Forrestal, and every Essex-class carrier in service. The French restructured Clemenceau. The Australians modified Melbourne. Even the Soviets, who had called the concept Western fantasy, secretly began their own conversions after losing too many jets to barrier crashes. The revolution was complete, but it was quiet. No parades, no medals, just fewer funerals, fewer widows, and pilots coming home who otherwise would have vanished into the sea. And while the world's navies celebrated their modernization, Dennis Cambell simply went back to work. He didn't give interviews. He didn't seek credit. He was still haunted by the funerals that had started it all. Because for him, this was never about fame. It was about faces. The faces of the pilots who should have lived. History had changed forever. But the man who saved thousands of lives disappeared quietly into the background. What happened to Captain Dennis Cambell after his breakthrough, and why his greatest legacy isn't the angled deck itself, will surprise you. The world's carriers were changing. Steel decks tilted 8 degrees to port, painted lines angled like arrows of survival, flight crews moving with a confidence they hadn't felt in years. Naval aviation had entered a new era. But the man who made it possible never stepped into the light. Captain Dennis Cambell could have been a hero in headlines. The Americans wanted to interview him for Time. The Royal Navy wanted to hold a press ceremony. The engineers at Farnborough wanted him knighted. But when the letters arrived, He simply declined. He didn't want recognition. He wanted results. In 1954, Cambell was quietly promoted to Rear Admiral. He attended the launch of HMS Ark Royal, the first British carrier designed from the keel up with an angled deck. Reporters swarmed him on the dock, microphones thrust toward his face. "Sir, what does it feel like to see your design change the world?" Cambell smiled politely and pointed to the engineers beside him. "Ask them," he said. "They built it." He left the ceremony early. There was another event that mattered more. The funeral of a young pilot who'd served under him in 1943. The lieutenant hadn't died in a carrier crash. It was a helicopter accident, completely unrelated to Cambell's work. But Cambell still attended, standing silently at the graveside as if the loss were personal. Because to him it was. Every fallen pilot always was. When the Admiralty awarded him the CBE in 1957, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, the citation was 2 sentences long. Cambell didn't display it. He tucked the certificate in a drawer and went back to work. After retiring from the Royal Navy in 1960, he joined Hawker Siddeley Aviation as a consultant, working on the design of vertical takeoff jets, the early ancestors of today's Harrier. Colleagues remember him as a relentless advocate for pilot safety. "He'd stop design meetings dead," one engineer recalled. He'd point to a component and ask, "What happens if this fails at night in bad weather?" We'd say, "Dennis, the odds of that happening are 1 in 10,000. He'd just shake his head and say, "Then tell me what the pilot does when he's that one." He was never interested in odds, only outcomes. Not in efficiency, only survival. By the time he passed away in April 2000, at the age of 92, the angled deck had become so standard that youngest pilots didn't even know it was once revolutionary. The Times printed 4 paragraphs for his obituary. The Guardian ran 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither captured what it truly meant, because the meaning wasn't in the metal. It was in the men who came home because of it. Every carrier landing today, from the U.S. Navy's massive Gerald R. Ford class to the sleek French Charles de Gaulle, uses an angled deck tilted exactly 8 degrees, just as Cambell drew it in his notebook in 1951. Modern pilots make over 15,000 carrier landings every year. About 8% of those are bolters, missed wire go-arounds. On a straight deck, that would mean over 1,000 potential crashes every year. On an angled deck, it means nothing more than another try. Hundreds of lives saved each year. Tens of thousands over 7 decades. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black of the U.S. Marine Corps hunted down Cambell's family in 2003. He'd flown FA-18 Hornets off carriers for 22 years. His letter said this: "I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings in my career. I boltered 42 times. 42 times I might have died on a straight deck. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again. Your father gave me 42 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life." Cambell never saw that letter. He'd been gone 3 years, but his son framed it, not because of the words, but because of what they meant. It wasn't about invention or glory. It was about humanity, because sometimes the most important breakthroughs don't come from the loudest voices or the highest ranks. They come from someone who simply refuses to accept that "that's how we've always done it" is a good enough answer. Dennis Cambell wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a visionary genius. He was a man who looked at dead pilots, at grieving families, and said, "No more." And with 1 line of ink across a page, he gave the world's aviators something priceless: a second chance. A second